Hey everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, welcome. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Caleb Holloway. I'm a designer on the product team here at Pendo. And we're going to be talking about how to validate prototypes faster with Pendo. So just before we jump in, if you're new to Pendo, just a quick overview. Basically, Pendo lives at the intersection of insights and actions. You can learn and gain insights from qualitative and quantitative data coming into the product, and then use that to take action through guides and in-app announcements and things like that. And today we're actually going to talk about using our guides product to create qualitative insights to help you on your product development journey. So what specifically are we covering today? Well, first off, what is the role of in-app prototype testing in the product development process? Obviously, this is kind of something new that we at Pendo here are exploring on the design team, and we found a lot of success with it, but we'd like to share with you some details of that and how that can sort of find a home in your own process. And then after that, we'll cover, literally how to build an effective prototype delivery guide. We'll be using Figma today, as that's what the design team here at Pendo uses, but just know that this will also work with Envision or any other prototype system that has an embeddable online component. And then finally, we'll talk about how to leverage Pendo segmentation to deliver this prototype to users who can provide the most relevant feedback on your concepts. So what is the role of in-app prototype testing in the product development process? Well, like I said, this is something that we on the Pendo design team have been experimenting with for a little while now. And a few points about how we found success with this is, first off, you can save time by securing feedback from your users asynchronously. Basically what that means is you can say, push this guide out with a prototype, get users to test it out, give you feedback on their own time, and then you can be working on other things, come back in a couple of days, see what they had to say, and get back to it. Also, you can increase the volume of qualitative data on your concepts by offering your users an opportunity to sort of give their opinions without necessarily taking time out of their calendar to schedule a meeting with you, set up a call, all of that. You can also leverage context by delivering a prototype in-app. So basically what we mean by that is you might be working on a specific portion of your app, either introducing a new feature or improving a current one. And if you can show that to people and get their feedback sort of in the context of the thing they're already using, that can definitely help context set and help them give you more quality feedback. And finally, we actually leverage this process to then bolster our efforts on sort of the live interview side. So we'll usually identify some key people who care a lot based on their feedback on our in-app prototypes and actually follow up with them in person or on a call to talk about it more in depth. So how has this gone so far for us? Well, here are a couple of metrics based on our experiments so far. So by delivering prototypes in-app and then requesting feedback after the fact, we usually see around a 49% response rate, which is pretty solid. And as I mentioned, you can save time. So we generally see statistically significant data in 2 to 3 days. And obviously that varies based on how many people you're segmented to and various things like that. But generally, it's a pretty quick turnaround that can fit really nicely into the Agile process. So one thing I would like to cover is, is this the only thing that we do to sort of get data on our prototypes? And the answer is no. Like, we here at Pendo definitely believe in interacting with our customers and talking to them in person or on video calls and sort of presenting our concepts to them, having that conversation. But in-app delivery of prototypes is actually just another angle that we like to hit, just to add a different lens to how we validate a concept. So this is just kind of an example of how those two can play a role. So live interviews, obviously, usability tests, again, whether those are in person or over the phone, those are definitely helpful for being more exploratory, doing more advanced usability testing, having a conversation with your users, right? So the only potential trade-off to that is that it is time consuming both for you and for them. And so you'll get a lot of directions out of that. You'll start with your hypothesis and talk to a few people and get a lot of concepts and a lot of direction out of that. But again, you only have time to talk to a few people. And so on the other hand, you can think about the concept that we're talking about today, which is in-app testing, in which case you can take one single direction, which is a hypothesis about a specific thing, a solution you have in mind, and present that to a whole lot more people and get a lot more, admittedly high level, but much more snackable feedback. So these two can actually play a role together in that we might, as part of the same process, whether simultaneously or sequentially, we'll actually, schedule some live interviews, push a prototype out in the app. If someone has very specific particular feedback on the in-app experience that we'd like to dig into more, we'll usually follow up with them with a live interview. And then on the flip side, if we have some more deeper learnings on the live interview side, we'll usually take those learnings and sort of feed those back into our prototype in-app experiences to drive those to better insight. So yeah, definitely just two approaches, and we definitely recommend finding how these two fit together for you based on whether you're pursuing more just that high level sort of gut check sentiment on a single concept, or if you are more interested in talking to a few people in depth. So I'm going to switch over to the demo now on how to actually set up this guide to be the most effective. So I'm going to jump on over here to Pendo. And I've set up just a basic guide already that I've called Contacts Prototype Test. And this is basically where we will be hypothetically validating a solution to how we might better improve the creating a contact experience in our app. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this guide in our app. So I'm here on the contacts page in our Acme CRM product. And as you can see, I've already set up this first step. And this is what we like to call the intro. So basically, this is going to say, hey, users, we are working on this thing. It's a new concept, and we'd like you to see it and give us feedback. And we found a lot of success in actually targeting this in the context of what it is you're working on, as I mentioned before. So in this case, we're on the contacts page. We're working on a new idea for how to improve the Add New experience. So as you can see here, I've just put a badge here next to the Add New button to say, hey, there's something related to this that we'd like to show you. And we've also found success with badge activation, because then you can say, hey, there's something special here, but if you don't have time to get to it right now, you can always come back to it. So we found success with badge activation as opposed to just throwing something up one time and then hoping people click on it that time. So I can edit this content and say, we're working on a new way to create contacts. And then of course, we'd love your thoughts on our vision, so on and so forth. One thing I do want to point out is that it's important you give your users context of what they will be expected to do after this step. So you want to say, you're going to click, you're going to launch a prototype. We'd like you to try it out, and then you'll have an opportunity to sort of give us feedback afterwards. So that's our first step, and this is important to kind of get people in the door and set context. But our next step is, definitely the most important, which is going to be our prototype itself. So down here, I've got a layout set up for a prototype container, and I'm going to walk you through kind of how this is set up and why it is the way it is. So first off, when you're showing someone a prototype in-app, we've found that it's best if you preserve some context to the app behind them. So this is going to behave kind of in a full screen manner, but almost pseudo full screen where you can still see the original app behind it. And that basically just says, hey, we're showing you something cool, but anytime you can exit out and go back to what you were doing. So we've just got a black box right here, but let me go ahead and edit this code block. This is basically just a custom code block that we added in the Pendo Visual Design Studio. And I've got a space here with an iframe. So I'm going to jump over to Figma. And again, I'm using Figma because that's what we use here at Pendo on the design team. But again, you can use this with InVision or anything else with an embeddable component. So I'm just on my regular project view here, but I'm going to switch over to the prototype view. And in the prototype view in Figma, you're going to want to make sure that you set the presentation settings to fit or scale down to fit. I think the default is 100%. But basically what this does is when you set fit, it's going to make sure that this prototype is responsive so that when you display that guide on a variety of viewports, it's going to make sure it scales down properly so that you don't force your users to like scroll around a giant prototype. So make sure you set fit before you generate the embeddable code. But once you've done that, go ahead and click Share Prototype and then Get Embed Code. And just copy this right out of there and go back to your guide. So again, this is just a regular custom code block in Pendo where I've got an iframe centered setup. So I'm just going to drop this iframe code in from Figma, and then I'm going to remove the width and height settings. And that's just because we've got extra settings on the guide itself that will allow it to scale properly. So as you can see, I've already got my little prototype back here that's loaded up nicely. But over here on the CSS tab, I'm just going to cover a little bit about what makes this work properly. So here we've got a background color, and that's basically just setting that iframe box to be black so that in the second or two it takes the Figma prototype to load in, it's not a weird flash. We've got a few extra styling bits here with box shadow and border radius and so on just to make this look nice. But the real magic is here in the height and width. So this is what I mentioned about making sure that that iframe in the prototype stays responsive. So we've set our height and width to 85% viewport height and 85% viewport width. And that's basically what allows this guide to be almost full screen, but still preserve some context of the app behind it. So once I've got that set up, I can close out of that. And now my Figma prototype is loaded up. So this is fully functional as you would expect the prototype to behave. So I can click into this normally, go through my prototype, and it all works nice. So up here at the top, I've got a button that says close prototype and give feedback. And this is important because this is what allows your users to progress to the third step where they will actually give feedback. And this is their only way out. So make sure that this is set up in a place that they can find it. So they're not just stuck in an endless loop in your prototype. So now that I've got my prototype set up, I'm going to go ahead and add a third step, which is where people can actually tell me what they think about this prototype. So I'm going to add my step 3 of 3 for prototype delivery. And that's basically just saying, hey, thanks for testing this out. What did you think? And there are a variety of ways you can handle this. This most simple option would just be a simple open text poll like this out of Pendo, which is just saying, hey, tell us what you think. You could actually add 2 or 3 of these, which are like, what did you like? What did you not like? Or if you're testing very specific questions, you could ask more pointed things about specific parts of that prototype. And then this is something else that we've experimented with and found some success, which is an opportunity to schedule a call asynchronously. So we've hooked this up before with like a Calendly link. I've done it with my calendar before. And that just makes it easier for people to get on your radar and say, hey, I'd love to talk with you about this in more detail. And so it just kind of cuts down that turnaround time of having to set something up. But yeah, so once we've got this survey step set up, it's usually nice to put in a confirmation step as well. So I'm going to add one more here with like just a pull response success to say, you know, hey, after you've submitted your feedback, thanks a bunch. You've been super helpful. You can customize this to be more about the concept that you're working on if you want, but just generally saying, hey, you're all done. Thanks a bunch for your help. So I'm going to go ahead and save this guide. All right, there we go, and exit out. And I'm going to head back to my guide details here. So as you can see, here are my 4 steps. So just to recap kind of how this is going to go. So we've got our initial step that's covering, you know, what this is all about, what we expect from you, and how to progress. So once you launch the prototype, you're going to open up that prototype step, go through it, and once you're done, then you can click close prototype and get feedback. Your users will then be progressed onto the survey step where you're saying, what did you think? How is this going to be helpful for you? So on and so forth. And then they're presented with kind of a thank you confirmation. So once this is published and live, you can expect to see pretty quickly in your pull responses tab, the feedback start to roll in. And like I said, it's usually only taken us 2 to 3 days, depending on the segment that we're targeting with this guide, to get substantial feedback from our prototype tests. So now that you've got your guide set up to deliver your prototype, let's talk about the segment. And the segment is important for ensuring that you are delivering this to the body of users that can give you the most relevant feedback. So while you could say, I just want this to go to my entire user base, what we found success with is targeting that more specifically to people who are familiar with the feature and can speak better to how that feature could improve. Or if it's a new feature, speak better to how that might improve their use of your product. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this segment builder and add a custom segment for this guide. So as I mentioned, part of the relevance aspect of this is about being familiar with the feature as it is if you're working on a feature improvement. So as you might have seen before, I targeted a guide to that little add new button on the contacts page because we're working on a way to improve that contacts experience. So I want to find people who have experience with the add contacts feature. So I'm going to pick feature, web apps, and then contacts, added new contact, used at least, let's say 5 times. So basically what that says is if the person that I'm segmenting to has clicked this thing at least 5 times, they should have enough experience with that feature and that workflow to have enough context to give me quality feedback on how that might improve. But maybe this is not necessarily broad enough for me, so I can also add, an or rule for like, either they've used it 5 times or they've used it recently, let's say within the last 7 days. So maybe they haven't used it 5 times, but they've at least used it recently, so it's top of mind, they're familiar with it, and they could give relevant feedback about that thing. So I'm going to go ahead and save that custom segment. So you've got 114 eligible visitors for this segment, which is actually ideal. We found, targeting maybe 1 to 2 to 300 people gives you a good body of users who give you a good enough response rate and sort of volume of feedback, but also is not going to hit a huge portion of your user base if you have quite a few users and can keep this fairly focused to the people who can care about it most. But if you have a larger set of users who are eligible, there are a couple other things you can do to make this a little more interesting, which is using something we call sample group, which is, if I add another rule here, if you're not familiar, Pendo by default will assign a random number to each of your visitors between 1 and 100, and that will then inform this sample group rule. So if I click sample group, let's say greater or equal to 50, that's going to grab all those visitors who match or who have been assigned default numbers between 50 and 100. And that's essentially going to grab me a half or 50% sample of this entire segment. So I'm going to segment this down and then click save. So now I just have 64 eligible visitors, right? So that's an easy way to pare this down if you feel you have too many people in the segment. Some other opportunities you can use sample group for are actually like an A/B. If you have two concepts you want to test, you could hit the same segment, but one sample, the top 50% of that segment with one, and then just duplicate this and say, less or equal to 49, and sort of hit the bottom sample and test those two things simultaneously. Or you could use this sequentially, where you're happy with this segment, but you test, one sample with one prototype, you get those learnings back, you say, great, let's iterate a little bit, let's send out another prototype to that other sample. So it's just another opportunity to make this a little bit smarter. Let's say this is good and we save the custom segment, and then we're good to go. So once you're ready, you've got your guide set up, your prototype is hooked up, you've got your segment, you can go ahead and hit publish and watch that feedback roll in. So that's about all we have to cover today, but we'll now open this up for questions. If you have a question, feel free to hit the little Q&A on Zoom. Our first question is the last field meant to be a percentage? So I assume you're referring to the sample group portion of this rule. So this last field is creating a percentage, but this in and of itself is not a percentage. So as I mentioned, each visitor in your subscription is assigned a random number. And we're just saying, find the visitors who have numbers assigned between 1 and 49. And because those go between 1 and 100, I can use this to create a percentage. So I could say, less or equal to 10, and that would give me a 10% sample. But if I were to say greater or equal to 10, that would give me a 90% sample. So hopefully that clears it up a little bit. Next question is, could you show us what the results look like? So I'm afraid I can't show you exactly what the results will look like in terms of just, personal information and privacy and that sort of thing. But once you launch this up and start getting those poll responses, based on your filters, you can look at this poll responses tab and it'll show a question for, whatever your poll question is here. And you can click into that and it'll show a table of those responses. So it'll show who gave the response, when they gave it, what the response actually is. And then you can add, a variety of other columns to this, like what's their account ID, what's other metadata about them, that kind of thing. So let's say your prototype is a wizard with 3 pages. Can you ask for feedback on each individual page as the user is going through it, or can you only ask for feedback at the end? So because these are sort of based on guide steps, you will need one guide step per piece of the flow. If you want to ask questions in between, basically what you're going to need to do is create a step for each stage of that. So you might have your intro, you have your sort of first prototype, and then you have another step for feedback on that first prototype, and then you just have another link to launch that second prototype. And based on the way Figma works, and I believe InVision works this way too, you can pick different starting screens based on the link. So you could probably logistically have one prototype and just set up different starting screens with different embedded iframes on each of those steps. Just as a best practice for Pendo guides though, if that's what you require to get good feedback, go for it. But there is something known as like user fatigue, or when you're presenting all these steps to people, you may suffer like a lower response rate at the end, depending on how many different steps you make them go through. So just use your best judgment about how much you can realistically get your users to give you in terms of time and effort before that drop off starts to happen. Can you export the responses for further analysis? Yes, you can. So once these responses start rolling in, you can use this little actions button and download a CSV. And of course, you can use that to your heart's content with all of the data you've chosen to populate here. Are there certain kinds of projects / prototypes that are better in the system than others? That's a little bit of a gray area, but we found that like if you're going to deliver a prototype in-app, the ones that work better are the simpler ones where you have a very specific flow, a very specific solution you're trying to test, so that that user doesn't need a lot of hand-holding or a lot of context to make it through on their own. If you have a prototype that's way more convoluted or requires a lot more sort of background or context setting, those can work, but we found better success just taking people through those in person. So again, it's up to your best judgment about if you think that this is sort of a concise, snackable enough prototype to get people through it on their own. All right, I think that's about it as far as questions. We're about out of time, so thanks everyone again so much for joining this. I hope it was helpful, and have a great day.